Waiver Wired Week 2. I'm Theo Gremminger. I'm going to be hosting Waiver Wired this year. I'm super hyped for it. Shout out to the Podfather. You're still going to be able to catch him on Top 10 Takeaways, but a lot of you have been watching my Waiver Wire videos last year and this year. We dropped one last week, and it hit. And hopefully everybody picked up little Jordan Mason, because Jordan Mason went absolutely nuts last night. 28 carries, 147 yards. I recommended him as a 20% guy. If you had a preseason waiver wire run, drop the 20%, get yourself some Jordan Mason. And I had a couple people pushing back on that one. They said, Theo, that's a little much. Maybe this is like a 10% guy, but Father Time is undefeated, and Christian McCaffrey was already banged up. So at the end of the day, McCaffrey, every time he's on the field, absolute stud. But maybe you get 4 or 5 starts out of Jordan Mason, and we're willing to pay for that. When we're talking about waiver wires, we're talking about paying for wins. We are willing to get guys and use them in our lineups. And whether that's a 3-week run, a 5-week run, those are the kind of guys that push you over the edge. And if you happen to hit on one of those players in the fantasy football playoffs, that can be the difference between winning your league and losing your league. Every single year, those late round additions, some of those guys really hit. But let's not get it twisted. We're talking about week 1. And week 1 waiver wire every single year, even this year, is going to be one of the best weeks we have. In past years, there's been a ton of like really obvious names. Like last year at this time, if you were watching my videos, we talked about Puka Nacua. We talked about Kyron Williams being must-add guys. Those guys really, really hit. And those were like really, really obvious, though. The question with those guys was, how much fab should we spend? It wasn't like, should we add these guys? This week, there's a lot of players we really need to sift through. So to get something out of the way that I do my waiver wire column is also how I'm going to treat this show. We're not going to delve too much into really, really obvious players. Like any waiver wire show you're watching today that's telling you to grab Jordan Mason is probably not giving you great advice. He's rostered in 58% of Yahoo leagues. By all means, go grab Jordan Mason if he's available in your league. But for almost everybody watching this, he's already rostered. And players like J.K. Dobbins are also rostered. J.K. Dobbins is a 50% rostered player, and Rashid Shaheed is a 55% rostered player. So if a player is available in less than in 50% of leagues, it's not really what I'm going for. No disrespect to the shallow league players. I'm going to list some shallow league ads, but I want to delve into players that are available in 70% of Yahoo leagues. I think if we use that as our threshold, and I go all the way down pretty much to the needle, I have a couple of players today that are available in 100% of Yahoo leagues. But if we go down to the needle and we focus specifically on the lesser rostered players, it's going to give you a lot more. And I'm also going to talk about guys that I want you to be a week ahead of. Last year in my waiver wire column, last year in my waiver wire videos, I got a lot of people thanking me for being a week ahead. And it's not a flex, but if we can save fab by kind of seeing things and being a week ahead, that's the way to kind of win in fantasy. So a lot of players like Jaden Reed was a guy that we added over and over and over again for like a few week stretch. And then he had his incredible run weeks 10 and on. He was a wide receiver 10 overall. Devin Singletary was another guy where we started seeing the writing on the wall with Damian Pierce. We were able to add him, and a number of you were able to get starts from Devin Singletary. Last year at this time in week 1, CJ Stroud was coming off a very strong game, but there were certain fantasy managers who didn't necessarily want to push the chips in, thought it was maybe a 1-week thing. So we want to try to be a week ahead. And I think the worst thing for you to do is ignore week 1 usage, because week 1 usage is the first time that we're actually seeing NFL teams telling us the truth. Jordan Mason said that he knew that he was starting since Friday. I didn't hear that from any 49ers beat reporters. I don't think you did as well. But like NFL teams withhold stuff all the time. Preseason, they withhold stuff all the time. And it's a matter of week 1, we finally get that big data dump where we find out what they're thinking. And as fantasy managers, we need to act on it. And if you're looking at this waiver wire run and you're saying, hey, in my league, a lot of these guys are not available. There are going to be players available that you need to adjust the back of your roster with. guys that we want to see for another week. There's going to be a number of those players we're going to talk about. But let's talk about just get it out of the way. Let's talk about the shallow league additions. These are players that are available in fewer leagues than I'd like to talk about. So like Baker Mayfield right now is available in 65% of Yahoo leagues. For us, we're going to kind of ignore that, but Baker Mayfield looked really, really good. If you need a quarterback, he's available in your league. That offense was humming. Jalen McMillan was on the field for 80% of snaps. You add Jalen McMillan into that mix with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, you're talking about some juice at the wide receiver position. And then you add Bucky Irving into that running back room. You're talking about having another running back who can catch passes and a more efficient runner than Rachaad White. We're going to talk about McMillan and Bucky Irving a little bit later, but Baker Mayfield doesn't make my top 10 overall, but he's a guy that we want to pay attention to if he's available in your league. A couple of running backs who are kind of no-brainer additions, but they do not meet our threshold for roster availability. Obviously, Jordan Mason, anybody who watch Monday Night Football, you don't need me to talk about it. There's a reason we had him as a 20% recommendation guy in last week's Waiver Wire column. And you can read my Waiver Wire column at playerprofiler.com. It's up. At the time you're watching this video, it's up. It's not paywalled. It's for free. We go deep in there. Jaleel McLaughlin is available in 63% of Yahoo leagues. Jaleel McLaughlin and Javonte Williams ADPs maybe should have been flipped. At least they should have been closer to one another. There was some Javonte Williams steam. I was out in Vegas last week drafting in the FFPC, drafting in the NFFC, and Javonte Williams steamed up. But Jaleel McLaughlin looks good, and this coaching staff believes in Jaleel McLaughlin. At the very least, this is a split. We'll see this week. But Denver last week against Seattle, Jaleel McLaughlin, there were some positive signs there. Ty Chandler is another player who just missed. He's available in 67% of Yahoo leagues. Ty Chandler is sort of a must-roster player. Aaron Jones looked great last week. All respect to Aaron Jones drafters. You had a really, really exactly what you wanted to see out of Aaron Jones. In a game that the Vikings were in control of, Aaron Jones shined. That's what you want to see out of your running back. But Ty Chandler also flashed. He out-targeted Jones 3-2, and he had 11 total touches. I think in games that the Vikings are trailing, Ty Chandler is going to be a lot more useful than what we saw last week. And then we'll keep it going. Wide receivers that did not meet our threshold because he's rostered in too many leagues, but might be available in your league. He's actually available in a few of my dynasty leagues, shallow dynasty leagues. Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks is the winner with Jake Ferguson missing time. We'll talk a little bit about Schoonmaker and the tight end options in Dallas a little bit later, but Brandon Cooks available in 67% of Yahoo leagues. He's going to see an uptick in usage with Jake Ferguson missing time with the MCL injury. This is going to be the secondary target in Dallas. I think you can treat him as a flex, as a wide receiver 3. And the Jalen Tolbert threat was greatly exaggerated. Tolbert was certainly a player that I was interested in. I had him in my sleepers column, but Brandon Cooks is well ahead of him. And then one other player that's going to get kind of brushed aside, he's available in 63% of Yahoo leagues, but it's going to be like a league specific where I bet you there's some competitive leagues, some FFPC, NFFC, some deeper leagues where you have those 20 or 20 plus roster leagues where Gabe Davis might still be available. And I know this is one where a lot of people might not like this one, but Gabe Davis out-snapped Christian Kirk 50-38, and he led Jacksonville wide receivers in total snaps. So like Gabe Davis is never one that we're super comfortable having in our lineups, but Gabe Davis, if he's going to get this sort of snap share with his ability to produce big games and his ability to catch touchdowns, then he might be sort of like a what the heck flex, like a flex you throw in a week that you're in, need of someone, or like a bye week fill in. And we have bye weeks coming up right down the line. Another thing we want to try to get ahead of. But Davis is interesting because he has 33 career touchdown catches, and he has 9 games with 15 PPR points or more over the last 2 seasons. So, like, don't go nuts with this one. But if I need wide receiver depth, he's one that I want to get into. Okay, so we're going to get back. When we come back, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to dive into the players you can actually get. We're going to talk about players who are rostered in, they're available in at least 70% of Yahoo leagues. We're going to talk about Isaiah Likely. We're going to talk about a number of players who you can add this week, and they can help your fantasy football team win this season.
DFS getting harder every year, but we're here to make it easier with the DFS Dominator, because I know a lot of optimizers keep coming out. Oh, our optimizer. What about this optimizer? But that optimizer. Well, we have a cash game optimizer that leverages the projections from Dario, Billy, the award-winning projections at playerprofiler.com, and builds the best lineups for cash games that have both upside and stability, because that's what you want. It's a couple clicks, boom, boom, boom. You get the best possible lineup for your cash games. But for tournaments, traditional optimizers don't work. That's why we have a Lineup Genius, which takes you through the process of building lineups the way they should be built. Which quarterbacks you want to be overweight on, then building stacks, then setting runbacks, then optimizing and generating up to 150 lineups that you can easily import into DraftKings, into FanDuel. That's the DFS Dominator. It's only $45 a year, not a week, a year. Just go to Player Profiler, click on the DFS Dominator from the menu, and you won't be sorry.
Welcome back to Waiver Wired. I'm Theo Gremminger. DFS is back. It's great to have football back. I'm sure a lot of you watching this on Tuesday stayed up, watched the Monday Night Football game last night. Very tilting for Jets fans. I live on Long Island, and seeing that Breece Hall fumble early on in the game, Breece Hall never fumbles, and seeing that fumble early on in the game, super, super tilting. San Francisco is an absolute juggernaut, missing Christian McCaffrey and still rolling one of the teams that we expect to be competing for a playoff berth in the AFC. So we didn't really learn a whole lot. One thing we did learn is the Tyler Conklin is one guy that I had in my waiver wire column. This is a guy that was available in 79% of Yahoo leagues. Well, next week he might be available in 90% of them, because Tyler Conklin is not the number 3 target in New York. The number 3 target in New York, and I should say the number 3 touch guy, because Breece Hall is going to get a number of carries as well. But the offense is really pretty consolidated and easy to figure out. You've got Breece Hall, you've got Garrett Wilson, and you've actually got Allen Lazard, who was targeted 9 times, catches 6 passes for 89 yards, gets that touchdown pass. So Allen Lazard's an interesting one. He was not in my waiver wire column because I write it before Monday Night Football, but Lazard is another one, wide receiver depth piece. Certainly not a top 10 ad for us, but a wide receiver depth piece. Let's start out the quarterback position. Again, all of these players are going to be available to you in at least 70% of Yahoo leagues. So shout out to you, not in my league, bro, managers. You're going to get some players if you stick with us next couple of minutes here. Justin Fields is available in a lot of leagues, and that's because Russell Wilson looked like the starter. Russell Wilson goes down with an injury. Justin Fields fills in, and Justin Fields was a guy where we were super excited about him. And this week was more of a game manager, but I think that Atlanta is a difficult defense to beat, especially on the road. So there were some positive signs when it comes to Fields. And the most positive is they're still going to have him running the ball. That's his MO, not surprising. But 14 rushing attempts is something that we can work with. And this was in a game where he didn't really have to drop back and pass at all. But he passed for only 156 yards. Arthur Smith did some very frustrating things with George Pickens. George Pickens looks awesome. But Justin Fields, we saw what he can do when he has a number 1 target like DJ Moore. With a single target, he can elevate them. Really seems to lock in, and he connected with George Pickens down the field. George Pickens had the highest amount of air yard share of any player in the NFL this past week. So some positive signs if we get another start for Justin Fields this week in Denver. But Fields is a guy that makes my top 10 overall because we've seen it in multiple seasons, what he can do as a runner. It elevates his fantasy floor, but he had 57 rushing yards this past week. In a game like Denver on the road in a difficult environment again for them. And I don't think Denver's great, but Denver's always a difficult place to win. If Justin Fields gets another start, don't be surprised if he goes for 80 plus rushing yards. Needs to be rostered. And you don't need to spend a lot because Russell Wilson threat to come back is there. And I think a lot of managers are going to say Justin Fields might not last. So I don't think you're going to have to spend as much on Justin Fields as you would have in years past. Sam Darnold also makes the list, and this is really for you Superflex managers. In a single QB league, I obviously do not recommend Sam Darnold, but he is locked in. That he did the most important thing he needs to do is win. And Darnold got the win in New York. New York looks just awful. But another thing that was important that we saw out of Darnold was him connecting with Justin Jefferson on a touchdown pass. Aaron Jones looks good. Minnesota looked a lot better than a lot of people anticipate. And Sam Darnold needs to be rostered in super flex leagues. Let's get to the running back position. And the running back that is the highest ranked player in my top 10 overall is Bucky Irving. Bucky Irving is nasty. Bucky Irving averaged 6.9 yards per carry, and this is the highest yards per carry that a Bucs running back has ever had in a debut. And Bucky Irving, I think there's certain people are going to dismiss it because Rachaad White ends up getting the pass catching role, and that was sort of what we wanted to see out of Bucky Irving. But he's still got 3 targets. He caught 2 passes for 14 yards, and he had 61 rushing yards. He looks much more efficient than Rachaad White as a runner. And certainly Bucky Irving doesn't have the size to be a bell cow. But if Rachaad White were to miss time, Bucky Irving has the juice to affect leagues. Don't want to call him the league winner if Rachaad White misses time. I don't want to be over the top. But Bucky Irving would be a guy that if you were ranking running backs for the week, would be a top 15 ranked running back every single week that Rachaad White missed. And even if Rachaad White plays, I think that the threat of Bucky Irving is there. The coaching staff loves him. He looks great in this offense. And we're going to see a lot this week against the Lions because it's Bucs Lions this week in a game that the Bucs will be an underdog. Do they lean on Bucky Irving a little bit? I think in shallow leagues, if Bucky Irving slips through the cracks, he'll be a massive addition a week from now. So Bucky Irving, spoiler alert, is my number 2 overall addition in my top 10 rankings at the end of the show. Let's keep talking. Let's talk about Alexander Mattison. And we're hearing from Antonio Pierce it's going to be a hot hand approach backfield. And Alexander Mattison looks like the guy over Zamir White at this point, which is really surprising. Zamir White's a guy who settled into that dead zone or right after the dead zone in redraft. There was some enthusiasm about Zamir White, but I think a lot of Zamir White drafters, even after 1 week, would like to switch their pick. And that's a whole nother story. Was it good process to dive into a Zamir White, a guy with a limited sample size? But that's for another time. Alexander Madison's a guy you can add, does not make my top 10. I think that this is a not great situation, but the appealing thing about Madison is they are going to use him as a receiver, and they're not doing that with Zamir White, and Dylan Lobby was inactive. So Alexander Mattison caught 4 passes for 43 yards and a touchdown, and he added 5 carries. They play Baltimore this week, a difficult matchup. I wonder if we're going to see more targets for Alexander Mattison, but I think that if you're a Zamir White drafter, add Alexander Mattison, especially if people are going to dismiss him, because you might need to hedge your bet here. You might end up with 2 players you can't start, but at the end of the day, you've invested in the Las Vegas backfield. Take a shot on it, and then if you need to get rid of one later in the season, by all means do it. But I'm not super thrilled to even have to talk about Alexander Mattison after last season, but we are here. He seems to be well liked by the Las Vegas coaching staff, and he's going to have an opportunity to catch passes this week against that Baltimore defense that's going to give Vegas a lot of issues. Ray Davis also makes this list. Ray Davis makes my top 10 overall, and he didn't hardly do anything. But I think Ray Davis needs to be treated as a priority handcuff for James Cook managers and a speculative lottery ticket for others. Looks great in a limited sample size, has a ton of juice. Jalen Wright, inactive last week, available in a lot of leagues. If he is cut in your league, consider adding him. This is a long-term play when it comes to Jalen Wright, and we might see him active this week because Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane, both a little banged up. We'll see Tuesday's practice report to see their involvement, but Jalen Wright was inactive. If either of those guys miss any time, Jalen Wright becomes a player we really, really want on our fantasy rosters. So we're not going to get scared off by the inactive tag yet. If he's inactive 2 weeks in a row, then we'll start getting a little bit nervous. But Jalen Wright is still a player I'm happy to have on my rosters. He has a ton of juice. And it's an offense where we know Miami's going to get fantasy production from their running back position. Devon Achane looked incredible. Raheem Mostert, disappointing usage. But if you drafted Devon Achane, you are feeling amazing right now. Antonio Gibson, and there's going to be a little pushback on this one, but I think that the involvement that the Patriots had with Ramondre Stevenson, completely leaning on him in a very running back centric offense. Antonio Gibson is just a handcuff, but an interesting one because I think New England has a lot of inexperienced wide receivers. They have Jacoby Brissett and then Drake May eventually taking over, but they're going to lean on their running backs. If Ramondre Stevenson misses time, I think Gibson would be a useful player. And then let's talk about two players who make my top 10 overall. Tank Bigsby, beast. Tank Bigsby looked awesome. And Tank Bigsby outproduces Travis Etienne on the ground, 73 rushing yards on 12 carries. Etienne's getting the receiving work, but Tank Bigsby, I think the community was 1 year ahead of. Like last year, there was enthusiasm on Tank Bigsby. He rose up and was like a 10th, 11th round pick in like really competitive drafts. Then he got cut. Obviously, it was a disappointment where you took him in ADP, but like Bigsby was a 3rd round pick in the 2023 NFL draft. He has size. And Doug Peterson said a couple months ago, we really like Tank and he will have a bigger role for us this year. And Doug Peterson told the truth on that one. So like Tank Bigsby, sort of like Bucky Irving, is going to be a guy that you can use as a handcuff plus. And that makes him appealing because it seems like using 2 running backs, keeping Travis Etienne fresh, and involving him as a pass catcher seems to be the game plan for Jacksonville. So Bigsby is not a full-time player. He only played 17 snaps, but in his 17 snaps, he gets 12 carries. This is a positive situation, and he is a priority addition for me. Makes my top 10 overall, which we'll talk about at the end of the show. Justice Hill, Baltimore, this is another team where we're going to talk about, obviously, Isaiah Likely when we get to the tight ends, but Justice Hill outsnaps Derrick Henry, 42-37, and Justice Hill gets 8 targets. The most of any running back in the NFL in targets last week was Justice Hill. The Baltimore coaching staff has always liked Hill, and it's been a guy where we've just sort of been waiting, but he's got so much experience with Harbaugh. He finishes with 6 catches for 52 yards and 1 carry. Now, we'll see his involvement this week against Las Vegas. This is going to be a week where we would expect it to be a heavy dose of Derrick Henry, but maybe Justice Hill is a week-to-week thing. And I do think this Baltimore offense is one that we want pieces of. And if Derrick Henry goes down with an injury, Justice Hill would be super, super useful and a guy we'd have in our starting lineups because, again, this is a prolific offense. The one curveball with Justice Hill would be down the line when Keaton Mitchell gets healthy, if he gets healthy. What will that offense look like? Because Keaton Mitchell last year had a lot of juice, again, coming off an injury, but just pouring a little bit of cold water on the Justice Hill situation. But he's still a guy that I want in as many leagues as possible. He makes my top 10 overall. And then Marshawn Lloyd. Marshawn Lloyd is available in a ton of leagues right now because he was inactive. We expected this. Lloyd is back in the practice field, but he's not ready to play. But there was some positives. Josh Jacobs didn't look great to me. And I realized that he picked it up in the second half, but in the first half of the game, did not look great. And we saw Emmanuel Wilson, a player that we fully expect to be behind Marshawn Lloyd, get a 20% rush share and have 3 targets in like the vacated what would be Marshawn Lloyd role. So I would consider like a 20% rush share and a handful of targets to be the floor for Marshawn Lloyd when he gets back. And I think he could cut into Josh Jacobs' weekly touches. Josh Jacobs is obviously the man in Green Bay, but I think you could end up seeing like a 60-40 backfield, and that's sort of been the MO for LaFleur for many years. If you recall the involvement A.J. Dillon had, even when Aaron Jones was cooking, they like mixing in 2 backs in Green Bay. LaFleur is one of the coaches who is synonymous with playing 2 backs, so I'm rolling with Marshawn Lloyd in any league I can get him this week. I love him as a speculative addition. And then I'll throw Emmanuel Wilson in there, especially for people playing in deep leagues. You're going to get another week of Emmanuel Wilson. And with the Jordan Love injury, Emmanuel Wilson is one where he might see an uptick in usage. When Marshawn Lloyd comes back, I fully expect Emmanuel Wilson to take a back seat. But Emmanuel Wilson is another player that the coaching staff in Green Bay likes, so you never know. Let's talk about wide receivers, and this is actually a really strong week for wide receiver additions. There's a lot of players that we want to add to our rosters. Some are going to be better options than others, but let's talk about them. And I'll start out with the situation that we really want to pay attention to, and that's the LA Rams situation, where my number one wide receiver recommendation this week, and it's one where I think we kind of know who the player is, but it's Demarcus Robinson. And Demarcus Robinson should step in and be in a full-time role with Puka Nacua missing time. And Robinson was a player that we know he has a capped ceiling. So if you're looking for a swing for the fences type addition to your team, this is not it. Demarcus Robinson is not going to like win leagues for you, but I do think he's going to provide wide receiver 3 value this week and moving forward with no Puka Nacua. He's a flex option for a lot of you watching, and he's available in a ton of leagues. At the time I was writing this article, he was available in 94% of Yahoo leagues. He's available in a lot of FFPC leagues and some NFFC leagues as well. So Robinson was a player that between weeks 13 and 17 last year, he had a touchdown or 6 catches, one of the two, or sometimes both, in every single game. A touchdown or 6 catches in every single game between weeks 13 and week 17. This is an interesting player. This is one where you should prioritize if you need wide receiver points right now. And there's other options in LA that are deeper here. Ty Johnson is one where he might slip through the cracks because it's Ty Johnson and he's never really done anything in his NFL career. But this was a star wide receiver at the University of Minnesota. A lot of you Dynasty managers and Devy managers know who Ty Johnson is very well, because this was a guy where when he was at Minnesota, people expected a ton out of him. They're like around the same time as Rashad Bateman. And Ty Johnson, it's never really happened, but we've seen some strange things in the Sean McVay offense, and he's a coach that's able to get a lot out of people. So I wouldn't discount Ty Johnson. If you're in a wide receiver heavy format and a deep format, he's one that you could maybe throw a 1% bid on and get. And this is a player where I think he's going to be like in an elevated wide receiver 3 role this week would be what I would think. You know, we've seen sort of like guys like Tutu Atwell have weeks in LA where they were useful. Maybe we'll see that with Ty Johnson. So if you need a guy where you're in a super deep league and you want to go get somebody for cheap, Ty Johnson, he was well ahead of Jordan Whittington. Now, Jordan Whittington's another player you can add. If you're trying to play the long game here and you just want to take a look at the situation, Jordan Whittington was an absolute stud in the preseason this year. Beast. University of Texas player, obviously played with Xavier Worthy, Adonai Mitchell, JT Sanders, Jonathan Brooks on that incredible Texas team last year. But Whittington's a player where he was so impressive in the preseason, but he played behind Robinson and Johnson. Now, I would expect that the Rams go with that, where it's going to be Cooper Kupp getting like 35% of the targets, and then Demarcus Robinson, Ty Johnson, and Colby Parkinson, who we'll talk about in a moment. But Jordan Whittington, if you want a speculative addition, this is one where if they self-scout this week and they say, we want to work in this kid Whittington's a player who can win. He made some really big plays, like yards after the catch type plays in the preseason. And this is a player that the coaching staff likes. Sean McVay talked about. So he's going to cost you not a lot because he was playing behind the other two this past week. One player where if you just want to put a wide receiver on your team and forget about him until he's ready, one player who I have rostered in a lot of leagues right now that I love rostering wherever possible is Josh Downs. And this week, you're actually going to see some fantasy managers cut Downs. So pay attention to the players that are cut this week. That's always a kind of good way of going about week one, because a lot of people will frustration cut. A lot of people will just change up their roster for whatever. And they drafted Josh Downs knowing he might not play week one, but they say, oh, there's a dude I want to add. I'm going to cut Downs and pick him up. Downs, if he gets cut, is a guy you should really, really add. Downs was having a great preseason. Looked like he was going to be the clear-cut number 2 star wide receiver the number 2 target on the team in Indianapolis. And this is a player that had 68 receptions as a rookie, which is the most all-time in Colts history. So I'm looking to add Josh Downs in leagues where he gets cut or in leagues where he's available. He's only rostered in 26% of Yahoo leagues, didn't play, so I'd imagine that number is going to tick down. You might be able to wait if he's rostered in your league, wait for the cut players waivers to clear, and then add him as a secondary ad this week. Sneaky way. And then I got to talk about him because he's in my top 10, but we can't ignore Greg Dortch. And I don't want to overreact to Marvin Harrison Jr.'s disappointing debut game. Like anybody who watched Player Profiler, Dynasty content, anybody who watched my redraft content all summer knew that I was excited about Marvin Harrison Jr. I'm still excited, but week 1 was a disappointment 100%. The narrative could have been a little different for Harrison Jr. if Kyler Murray would have connected with him on that long touchdown where he was wide open towards the end of the game. But that's neither here nor there. Harrison Jr. is still a 90% snap guy. He's going to have some big games. We're not going to get worried about that. But Greg Dortch is absolutely a thing. This is a smaller wide receiver who's had several strong games now with Kyler Murray. And he's led Arizona wide receivers in targets in 4 out of his last 9 games, which is not great, but it's noteworthy. It's almost 50% of his last 9 games. He has led the Arizona wide receiver room in targets. Interesting when it comes to Greg Dortch. He's a guy that gets open. Kyler Murray likes looking for him, and he appeared to be a big part of Arizona's game plan. He led Arizona in targets, led Arizona in catches, and Dortch outproduced Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride combined. Now that we're probably not going to say that again for the rest of the season, but Greg Dortch becomes a must add in deeper formats and in wide receiver heavy formats like NFFC, FFWC, or leagues like Sleeper and Yahoo, where your league is really up the number of wide receivers. Then Greg Dortch is definitely a player you want to add. He makes my top 10 overall. And there's one player who I want to kind of dive into because Alec Pierce is one that's going to get dismissed by a lot of fantasy managers because it's obviously unsustainable for a guy to average 40 yards per catch. But he had 125 yards and a touchdown on 3 targets, 3 catches, 3 targets. But it's interesting because Alec Pierce outsnaps Adonai Mitchell. He gets more snaps than him. And Alec Pierce is a guy where the 60-yard touchdown was awesome, but we have a quarterback with a rocket launcher cannon of an arm, and it seems to click with Alec Pierce's long speed. Like, this is a player where I want to add him for a very, very, very small bid. If your league is going to make you pay for the scoring, and I don't anticipate that, but if your league is going to prioritize Alec Pierce this week and make you really pay for it, it's not one I want to drop a heavy bag on. But if it's a league where I can slide by and add Alec Pierce for a cheap bid, then this is one I want to take a look and see what happens in week 2. Because again, it's sort of a perfect mesh when it comes with Anthony Richardson's rocket launcher arm, his ability to throw downfield deep, and the threat that he puts on opposing defenses as a runner, not to mention the threat of Jonathan Taylor as a runner, where it's sort of a perfect storm for Alec Pierce to be a big play guy. This could completely flip this week. Adonai Mitchell, he could have hit Adonai Mitchell on 2 big plays as well, but it was Alec Pierce this week. This wide receiver room is going to get even more complicated when Josh Downs comes back, but if I can grab Alec Pierce for like $1, a 1% bid, I'm doing that just to sort of see what happens. Another wide receiver that's super, super interesting is Wan'Dale Robinson. Wan'Dale Robinson is on a train wreck of an offense in New York. Like, Malik Neighbors is a stud, and that's it. But Wan'Dale Robinson was targeted 12 times. He catches 6 passes for 44 yards. He had a rushing attempt. So say that again. Targeted 12 times and had a rushing attempt. And I got news for you. This Giants offense is going to be getting beat down. This Giants defense is going to get beat down in several games. The offense can't hold on to the ball. So you're going to get opportunities for Wan'Dale and Malik Neighbors to be targeted every single game. The game flow is going to dictate that Robinson is going to be a guy where he's very much a floor play, but he's going to get target volume. He's the number 2 target in New York for sure, had the most targets this past week. And we have to remember, Wan'Dale Robinson was a second-round pick, and this is a guy that they invested a lot in. He's had injuries, but he's finally healthy, and New York trusts him. Wan'Dale Robinson is an ad in most leagues. He's available. Another player we talked about earlier with Baker Mayfield is Jalen McMillan. Jalen McMillan is nasty. This is a really, really good player. Now, Jalen McMillan played in 80% of snaps, and the targets were not there, but he did catch one touchdown pass, and it was his only catch of the day. But this is one who also drew a pass interference. Like, Jalen McMillan had very positive week 1 usage. We heard Baker Mayfield praise him in the preseason, talked about his professionalism, talked about how good he is, all the stuff you want to hear about a young wide receiver. So for me, Jalen McMillan is one that I really want to add. And then keeping it going in my wide receivers, Devon Vele, who I talked about in my waiver wire preseason column, or my waiver wire week 1 column, whatever you want to call it, that I wrote last week. And I did a video on him as well, where I think I was the only person in fantasy to talk about Devon Vele because he's a big slot. And Devon Vele dominated snaps over Josh Reynolds, or excuse me, Josh Reynolds dominated Devon Vele in snaps, 55-34. But Vele is going to get that slot usage. He's a rookie, and in his first game as a pro, gets 8 targets. If Devon Vele was named Marvin Mims or Troy Franklin, and he got 8 targets in his first game, people would be freaking out on the waiver wire this week. But because it's Devon Vele, he's going to go under the radar. He's absolutely a player I want to grab. A rookie wide receiver getting 8 targets and getting slot usage and having size is something we want to circle. And we have to remember, Devon Vele is super old. He's the oldest rookie wide receiver in the league. The guy is not your usual rookie. So they trust him in the slot. He's easily the Tim Patrick replacement. We remember Tim Patrick would have some okay fantasy performances, but Cortland Sutton gets like a 30% target share last week. It was like 28% target share. After that, I think Devon Vele can carve out a weekly role. He's one where I'm looking to add him for cheap where I can. And if you're in a wide receiver heavy format that is super deep and you want just a depth piece, Josh Reynolds, let's see where this thing goes, but he was targeted eight times as well. Let's talk about Andre Yoshevus. And he was a player that we talked about adding last week. I had him in my sleepers column. I had him in my waiver wire column. We talked about him this summer. And he's actually a player that I drafted on a few teams. I have him on some like FFPC, NFFC teams. But Yoshevus had what we wanted to see usage-wise. He played nearly every snap, and he had a 20% target share. We're going to see Yoshevus against a difficult defense this week in Kansas City, but the game flow could be a positive one for Cincinnati wide receivers, Chase Brown, and especially Jamar Chase, because Kansas City is going to put all kinds of pressure on Cincinnati to keep up. That Kansas City offense is going to put up a number this week. So we're going to see what Yoshevus does in a game where they're going to have to pass a lot. And then the final wide receiver I want to just mention, Xavier Legette. And this is another train wreck offense. But one thing I thought was interesting was Xavier Legette, first round pick, mega athlete, a guy who we weren't crazy high on in the Dynasty rankings at all. And we will fade him in Dynasty right now, but compared to other guys in his class, I should add. But Xavier Legette is, again, a first-round pick in the NFL draft. And in his first game as a pro, he gets a 22.6% target share. As bad as Carolina is, if you're a first-round pick, this kind of athleticism, getting 23% of the targets, then at some point you're going to be a waiver wire ad. So a lot of leagues he's going to get cut this week because people don't want Panthers, and it's an absolute train wreck. Deontay Johnson, what a disappointment. But Xavier Legette is one who you should actually definitely monitor. If you don't want to add him, just monitor him. And let's talk about our tight ends. And we got to talk about the number 1 waiver ad of the week, Isaiah Likely. No-brainer addition, number 1 ad everywhere. Even if you're in a shallow league, I would add Isaiah Likely over Jordan Mason. That's how confident I am in Isaiah Likely. The Baltimore Ravens were in 12 personnel more than any other team in football this past week. They were in 53% 12 personnel team. Isaiah Likely, basically you should treat him like he's the wide receiver 2 in Baltimore. Don't think about him as a tight end. He's a big wide receiver who has tight end eligibility. And this is one where we don't really need to talk about it. Like, you saw the game. He had the nastiest jump cut of the entire weekend to score that touchdown. He was the number 1 target on multiple reads from Lamar Jackson. Now, I think Mark Andrews will bounce back. Zay Flowers had 10 targets. There's target competition around him, but they're not going to put this back in the bag. Isaiah Likely is a starter for, like, unless you have Sam Laporta, Trey McBride, tight ends like that, then you need to consider Isaiah Likely. And if you have David Njoku or Jake Ferguson, 2 tight ends that went down with an injury, this is like a lifeline for you. Isaiah Likely is going to give you just as good production, maybe better than what you paid for those guys in ADP. Isaiah Likely is 24 years old. He had multiple smash games to end the 2023 season. He had 3 out of 4 weeks where he had like 18 PPR points towards the tail end of the 2023 season. And I know it was without Mark Andrews, but this is not something that's going away. Add Isaiah Likely, add Isaiah Likely, add Isaiah Likely. Don't be afraid to put a big bid on him. This could be an impactful player for you and a guy who starts all season long. And it's going to be a weird year where both Baltimore tight ends are going to finish as tight end 1s. Now, my next favorite tight end is going to cost you a lot less. You can go kind of under the radar here. And this player is not going to give you Isaiah Likely production, but Colby Parkinson is a guy you should be adding off the waiver wire. He had 3 catches for 45 yards in the first half for LA. Second half, it was a lot more wide receivers. He only gets 1 more catch, finishes with 47 yards, but it was a positive start and a sign of things to come. Puka Nacua is now headed to the IR, and I think Parkinson's weekly role is going to be very predictive. I think he's going to give you top 15 tight end production every single week, and he has a baked-in floor in this offense. And anybody who's been watching a Sean McVay team like for a long time, just remember those weeks where Tyler Higbee kind of went nuts. Colby Parkinson, I don't know if necessarily has that ceiling like we saw in some of the smash years for Higbee, but he does have potential to do that, in like a week or two basis. Like, Parkinson looks good, and they spent a lot of money on him this offseason. Let's talk about Luke Schoonmaker. Luke Schoonmaker is your ultimate speculative $1 bid type guy. He's going to be the replacement for Jake Ferguson in Dallas. Schoonmaker seemed like more of like an H-back type. Super athletic, though. Has the size. He's like 6'5", 260. Runs a 4.63 40. And anybody out there who plays Dynasty or follows speed scores, Luke Schoonmaker has 110 speed score. You're talking about a speed score that's like similar to a guy like Trey Benson. Like, any speed score 110 or above is nasty. And for a tight end to have that number is really, really interesting. Now, Schoonmaker hasn't done anything, but the argument is, does Dak Prescott make the tight end? And most people might say yes to that. You've seen 4 out of 5 years where the Dallas tight end is sort of like smashed and finished as like a top 10 player at the position. Dalton Schultz did it 3 years in a row. Jake Ferguson did it last year. And in 2019 was the last year that a tight end didn't finish like top 10 scoring in weekly PPR points per game for Dallas. And that was Jason Witten. And Jason Witten was like 1,000 years old, literally like 40 years old, maybe 40 plus at the time. And Witten was like tight end 16 on the year. So like, if Dak Prescott can make Jason Witten, who should have been retired at the time, tight end 16, then I think he can work with an athletic player, even if this guy might be more limited than most of his other tight ends. Like, Schoonmaker, at the very least, is a threat in the red zone. For you FFPC tight end premium managers, Schoonmaker is going to get bid on, and I think there's going to be some leagues where he goes for cheap. So don't go nuts on this one. Talking about a couple of other tight ends who are cheap, Tucker Kraft. Whatever you thought of Luke Musgrave is how you should view Tucker Kraft right now. Kraft was banged up in the preseason and still dominated Musgrave in usage. Kraft is the tight end 1 in Green Bay. Musgrave is the tight end 2 in Green Bay. Anybody who followed my waiver wire column last year or my waiver wire videos, there were weeks where we were adding Tucker Kraft, especially in tight end premium leagues. Tucker Kraft, when Jordan Love returns, Tucker Kraft is going to be interesting. And this is a player where don't expect a whole lot. Like, he's not a spike week guy, but he's a tight end too. and he's going to be on the field a lot in a plus offense when Love returns. Jordan Akins, this is the David Njoku replacement, where if you had David Njoku, you want to add his replacement. Jordan Akins is certainly not David Njoku, but Jordan Akins will become a priority addition in tight end premium formats. You probably don't need to add him in most home leagues, but he's definitely one you should monitor. Zach Ertz didn't do anything, but he dominated snaps over Ben Sinnott. This week, Washington plays against the New York Giants, two teams that got beat up, but Washington offense might look really good against this New York Giants defense that was just not as good as we anticipated. And I think Ertz is a guy where if you're in tight end premium, don't cut him. Wait for this week, see what happens. Don't cut him after last week. Was on the field a ton. One player who I think will be added in a lot of leagues, and if you're a Dynasty League manager, check and see if he's available. Theo Johnson. The threat of Daniel Bellinger was non-existent. Bellinger was outsnapped by Chris Mahertz. So this is Theo Johnson's position. He dominated the tight end snaps. Only targeted 4 times, but he rarely left the field. And Theo Johnson not only has the best name in the NFL, but the best first name, I should say, in the NFL, but he also has elite athleticism. And athleticism correlates more at the tight end position than anywhere else. And the final tight end I'll mention, Roma Dunze is going to miss some time. Keenan Allen is banged up. Gerald Everett could be a sneaky player for a couple weeks, where Gerald Everett was out snapping and out targeting Cole Kmet this week. Gerald Everett took this job during the offseason in Chicago, which is interesting because Cole Kmet's a guy that was very productive for the same coaching staff last year, and Gerald Everett took his job. So Gerald Everett's one where you can add, especially in tight end premium formats. And that's it. And I'll say anybody who's stuck to the end here for the top 10, most weeks I'm going to try to get this done in a half an hour. But this is week 1 where we had so many names to cover and so much roster cleanup. We wanted to load this waiver wired. My top 10 overall waiver wire additions. And obviously J.K. Dobbins, Rashid Shaheed, and certainly Jordan Mason would be top 10 ads. They'd all be in the top 5 if they were available. But for the leagues we're talking about, all of these players are available in at least 70% of Yahoo leagues. And we'll start at the top. Isaiah Likely is the number 1 ad this week, hands down, and there would be a tier break after him. If you're in a continual rolling list league and you have the number 1 waiver wire addition, it's a no-brainer. You're adding Isaiah Likely. If you are in a league with Fab, you're going to have to drop 25% plus on him, and he's worth it. Drop the bag, get Isaiah Likely. Certain leagues, he's going to cost 50%. You can cap yourself where you're at. Be roster specific on this, but if you have a poor tight end situation, consider dropping the bag on Isaiah Likely. Number 2 for me, Bucky Irving. I love Bucky Irving. High contingent upside player who gives us handcuff plus value, and Bucky Irving is just nasty. Demarcus Robinson, number 3 overall. Instant flex wide receiver 3 play. Tank Bigsby at number 4. Like Irving, he is a handcuff plus, but doesn't offer you the pass catching ability. But he is also a high level contingent upside play if Travis Etienne were to miss time. Justice Hill comes in at number 5. Greg Dortch, number 6 overall. Colby Parkinson, 7 overall. I'm going to be a little bit ahead on Colby Parkinson. Justin Fields, 8 overall. Justin Fields would have been much higher up the list if we had some validation that he can win this quarterback job. But we have to be careful with this one and not overspend on Justin Fields in case they switch back to Russell Wilson quickly. Ray Davis comes in at number 9. I'm very interested in having Ray Davis. And then Marshawn Lloyd, I'm going to be ahead of consensus, and I'm going to have him at number 10. He is a guy that we want to stash on our rosters. So once again, Isaiah Likely, Bucky Irving, Demarcus Robinson, Tank Bigsby, Justice Hill, Greg Dortch, Colby Parkinson, Justin Fields, and Ray Davis. And then we're going to close out our top 10 with Marshawn Lloyd. I'm Theo Gremminger. Read my waiver wire column every single week at Player Profiler. You can find me right here on Waiver Wired. And we're going to get after it this season. We're going to help you win in fantasy.
Hey, I want to take a moment to thank you for tuning in. It's important to me that all of our media be free. This is only possible because of you allowing a true independent sports media enterprise to thrive unlike any other in the business. So please subscribe to the All In Package to continue to make all of this possible, to ensure that all of our stats, information, data, content is available to you, especially you, the people that get the site and get the show.